I will never lie to you, but I may not tell you whatever.
That's my, yeah, turn the headset down. All right. How's that? Is that okay? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? You have to turn me up a little bit, up a little bit, up a little bit, a little bit up. On the headset? On the headset or pulpit? Headset. Okay, take it down a little bit. There you go. Turn the pulpit down too. There you go. And turn it down just a little bit. Right there. That's not bad, I think. Like, and bye-bye. That's funny. All right, good morning, everybody. It's past time to start. We were having a few technical difficulties. Sorry about that, but I think we've got it worked out. Maybe not. So we'll see what happens. We've had a number of changes, as you can see, over the weekend. We had a work day. Everything looks really great. Thanks for everybody who came out yesterday to help make things better. One of the things that was adjusted and changed was the pulpit. You can see we have a new pulpit, and the audio has been put up there. So I'm using the lapel mic, which is an adjustment for me. I don't normally do that. So, and some things are different back there. So anyway, that's all the excuses right there. It's ready. We'll just start with a bunch of excuses and call it good. So, all right. We have about 2 weeks left this week and one more in this class. I could possibly do another half week. Actually, you could probably do 3 or 4, but I'm kind of stumbling to the end here. I'm just kind of tired from going for so long, and it's kind of difficult to stay kind of in study mode all the time. And so we're going to turn this thing over to Lynn in a couple of weeks and let him get all super tired. But it's been a great class. So this class we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about the evidence for a young Earth, and we're going to talk about some problems with light and starlight and things of that nature. So the light thing is a little bit heady, so you're going to have to kind of stay with me. But the rest of it, I think, is not as hard to understand. But I do want to start class today with a prayer and then by reading some of Psalm 33. So let's bow. Dear Father, thank you for this time that we have to come and to learn about your word and about your creation. God, thank you that you have manifested who you are through your creation, and we are all without excuse because we can see the magnificence of your glory, your power, your loving kindness in everything that has been created. We just ask that we open our minds as we study this, and we can be ever more strengthened in our faith based upon the things that we are studying. God, we just thank you for Jesus and all that he has done for us. And we just ask that you continue to bring us closer together as a set of people who worship you. And we also ask that we have boldness as we continue to spread your word. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Psalm 33, starting in verse 6, reads this way. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and the breath of his mouth and all their host. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deeps in the storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations and frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart from generation to generation. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. I wanted to read that because that is a statement, really, of the psalmist here saying that God is who he said he was and that he spoke into existence all creation, right? We've been reading it in Genesis chapter 1, and that is a bold claim. And you can see why so many people don't believe it, right? They don't necessarily want to believe in a God who has that kind of power and who has that kind of sway over their lives. And we've talked about that. So I won't belabor that point. But Braden, can you hit the, thank you. But I want to talk a little bit about evidence and evidence rules, okay? Now, if you were accused of murder in the United States, right, and you had to go to court, right, what are some of the rules that we have in our justice system that protects the accused? So let's talk a little bit about that and how it has to do with evidence, okay? So what's one of the main things? You're innocent until proven guilty, right? And so who then is the burden of proof on? Is it on the defendant or is it on the those who would prosecute? Those who would prosecute have to bear the burden of proof. They have to be the ones to give the proof to say that that person did what they say that they did, right? Now, what came first, the creation model of the universe or the evolutionary model? The creation model, right? We have here a book that says, and this particular psalm was written long before anybody ever thought of the idea of evolution, right? And so in the end, as we look at the word and the claims made by the word, then where then is the burden of proof to say that this is wrong? Yeah, maybe it should be on the other hand, right? So we're going to look at that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. You know, evolution is a very new kind of concept in the history of time, right? We've had the Bible for thousands of years, and evolution's been around for hundreds. And so, you know, where is the burden of proof, right? Where is the burden of proof? Now, what are some other things that happen in a court of law? So let's say that I'm sure everybody in here has watched, you know, Matlock or something like that, or Perry Mason or whatever, right? Some of these law, you know, whatever, and court doesn't really work like those TV shows. You know, they make them very dramatic, right? Well, not those particular TV shows, but anyway. But they make them very dramatic, right? Because always right at the very end, you know, there's some new evidence that's introduced that shows that the defendant is, you know, not guilty or absolutely guilty, right? Because the evidence kind of shows what's going to happen. And most of the time, you know, somebody like a Matlock is defending somebody, and this new evidence pops to light, and immediately, right, the burden of proof is shattered, right? The proof is shattered that this person did this because they found evidence to the contrary, right? Okay, and you see that, right? And you also see that in actual court cases, right? Okay, so when it comes to this idea of having a young earth, we should go to the evidence. What does the evidence say? And we should then examine this by the evidence. One more. Okay, so Mount St. Helens. We've talked about that a little bit, but I want to go kind of in depth a little bit more in terms of Mount St. Helens because it is the laboratory that we can look and see these uniformitarianism principles, are they true or not, right? We can see things happening before our very eyes. Matter of fact, most of us were alive when Mount St. Helens erupted, right? May 18th, 1980, right? Most of us were alive when that happened. And now we can go and look at the area and see, what is the evidence that's presented there when it comes to geology and reformation of physical breaches and canyons and things of that nature. And we're going to talk about a few of those. So, Braden, hit another one there for me. All right, so this was a massive catastrophe, right? So for those of you who were alive and were living in Colorado at the time, did Mount St. Helens, being what, 4 states away, did it have an effect on Colorado? Yep. It did, right? What was the effect on Colorado? Ash, right? And I wasn't here at the time. Somebody explained to me, like, how bad was it actually here?
It wasn't as bad as being close to it, but it was as far out as it was. We were still getting bombarded with little flakes of ash.
Yeah.
Instead of the big colossal ones that you find up close to the...
Yeah. Yeah. That far away, this event still had an effect, a far-reaching effect, right? So obviously closer to the actual eruption, there was a lot greater effect. But there's no denying that this was a massive geologic and, just a massive catastrophe, right? It has long-ranging consequences. We lived in central Washington, not at the time that Mount St. Helens erupted, but later. And so we just came from there. And when St. Helens erupted, the wind pattern was such that it moved east and then came south, right? That's why Colorado was affected. But I can tell you where we were in Moses Lake, whenever you dug, right, you could dig down 5 or 6 feet and you would hit a layer of ash that was 6 to 10 inches deep. And they called it caliche because typically the water would come down and it would mix with the ash and it would create basically this really hard level of almost like rock. And they called it caliche. And the boys know because we many times we would put in a sprinkler system or whatever and you get down to the caliche like, that's rough, right? And so we could see that there. And I had stories told to me there that it was so bad in Moses Lake, which was, 250 miles or so approximately from Mount St. Helens, that people couldn't go outside for up to 2 to 3 days. And their cars were covered with ash like it would have been snow. You could barely even see, right? And so that's what happened there closer to the actual eruption. Braden? All right, one more. All right, so what you see when it comes to Mount St. Helens is that it is a great teacher for us in terms of what's happening geologically, okay? And so what you see on the screen there is kind of Mount St. Helens. So this would be basically the crater and the dome. So what you just saw in the picture was the ash being deposited from this particular area, okay? Now, it blew out this direction, and a ton of the damage was caused here. And we're going to look at a couple of different ones today. I'm going to show you some pictures of what happened on Spirit Lake and the interesting things that that tells us. We'll talk a little bit about the breach, and we'll talk about some of these canyons and what they tell us. Okay. So, what is this evidence, Braden? Okay, the first is that strata actually form very quickly. Okay, so the uniformitarianism model says that when you see in the side of the Grand Canyon or something like that, where you've seen something erode, that when you see these layers, what you see is millions of years of deposition of rock and dirt and things of that nature, right? And so then they have what's called the geologic column, and here are all the strata. This was laid down here, and this was 2 million years old, and this was laid down here, and this is 10 to 15 million years old. And based upon those particular ideas, the uniformitarianism types of ideas, then they measure the age of the Earth or that strata based upon some of their assumptions. Okay, we'll talk about it too. There's some what they call index fossils, which are tribolites. And those tribolites, basically, once they find those, they say, well, those were, approximately 55 to 65 million years ago, and so that's the strata that those are in. And then when they go to measure the other fossils, they measure them by where they're found compared in the strata. Okay, actually, it's circular reasoning, which is something that we really need to understand, right? They say that it's that old because it's in that strata, but then they say that the things that are in the other strata are that old because they're compared to the other things. So it's circular reasoning, which is a logical fallacy. So that's one thing to be known before we can get started.
Does this uniformitarianism hold the same from all the way around the world?
It is.
So the same dating and stuff is consistent?
Yes, and that's kind of how they do that. They do that by using those index fossils. And then when they go down, they say, okay, these are the same layers, in the geologic column.
So they're thinking that everything is laid down all over.
Yeah, all over, yeah.
Stacked up?
Yes, and in different regions, obviously, there's different thicknesses, right? But the important thing to understand in their theory is that these were laid down over millions of years, right? Millions of years. Okay, Braden? Okay, so why Mount St. Helens is so important to us is this. So this is a picture of a landslide that happened after Mount St. Helens. So this happened a few years later, okay? And what you see is a number of strata there, okay? So this is approximately, 50 to 60 feet, basically from the bottom to the top, okay? What you see here is at the North Fork of the Toutle River, there's the laminated bedded pyroclastic flow, okay? This happened in June 12th, 1980. So basically, that's this section right here. Okay, that section there, we know was laid down. We know the day that it was done. There was a secondary eruption, and we know that that whole 25-foot layer was laid down in a matter of hours in June of 1980, okay? Underneath it is the original layer that was laid down by the actual eruption of Mount St. Helens, okay? So basically, from where the guy's standing to the top there was laid down in just over a month, okay? So just over a month. And then what you see is that there's another overlay from there up. That was another mud flow by another eruption that happened, and that was basically in March of 1982. So this whole 60-foot column that you see there was laid down in just less than 2 years. And we saw all that happen. Okay, so what does that then do to the idea, the supposition of uniformitarianism types of idea, that these strata were laid down over many, many millions of years, right? It debunks it very, very quickly with a lot of physical evidence, right? We know when these happen, we saw them happen, we see the direct evidence of this, and you can see over 60 feet of strata laid down in less than 2 years, okay? That strike anybody as like amazing? It should, right? It should, because that's exactly what it is. It's direct physical evidence that flies in the face of evolution and these uniformitarianistic ideas. Okay, Braden? All right, so, and again, all right, so what we also see is evidence that these are laid down quickly through what are called polystrate fossils, okay? Polystrate fossils. So you just saw all of these layers that were laid down. Well, guess what we see all over the world, to your point? You see these things called polystrate fossils. Braden hit it again. All right, what a polystrate fossil is a fossil that exists amongst the different layers, and it transcends all those different layers, okay? Braden, hit the slide, please. Thank you. And so what you see is, according to the idea of uniformitarianism, is hundreds of thousands or millions of years, right? But what would be the mechanism for a fossil to survive and be laid in the different flows, right? There is no mechanism. What typically would happen if you had a large log, right, or a large animal, would they basically lay there for hundreds or thousands of years until they were fossilized? What do you see happen around you? Decay, right? And very quickly, by the way, right? And so in just a few months, you're down to nothing but just a skeleton that's left, and then even if that much, and then within a year or two, typically even the skeleton has decayed, right? And so most of the time, nothing ever gets deposited into the earth because it decays before it happens, right? So that's one major issue. The other is, how could then all of the rest of the flow be laid down gradually, burying a tree, because that's mostly what we see out there, fossilized polystrate, are large trees. How then would there be a mechanism for that to happen over long periods of time, right? It doesn't make sense for what we know about the way nature works.
If they say over the millions and millions of years, layer after layer after layer, where is the dust and all of that come from to make the layers?
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Like, I always wonder about that. How do cities get buried, right? Do they get buried like 1 inch at a time? That's usually not how it happens, right? They get buried like Pompeii, right? They get buried like that, right? So, absolutely. What you see here is a picture taken in the past of Spirit Lake, right? So Spirit Lake was kind of in the path of what was happening there in Mount St. Helens. And what happened was all of the trees that were on the side of the mountain were blown into the lake, right? They were all toppled like little twigs over, and then that force continued to push them down, right? And there's pictures of them where they're just strewn all over the landscape. It looks like, a fire came in, and then a bulldozer came in after the fire, and everything's just wiped out, and all the trees are on the ground, right? But many of them reached Spirit Lake, okay? And at one point, Spirit Lake was full of logs, and I got a picture of that here in just a couple minutes, full of logs, that basically there was no longer, you could hardly see any of the water, right? So what happens over time then is those logs then get waterlogged, right? And the ones that are heavier typically tend to turn up, and that's what you're seeing there. And so that's what we saw there on Spirit Lake, is that the logs got waterlogged, they turned up. Now, this picture shows each of them kind of tilted in one direction. That's because man went in and kind of messed with everything and actually artificially lowered the water level, and it made the trees kind of tip back over, so you can see that. Hit the next slide, please, Braden. All right, so that's what you see. So over time, what happens is they get waterlogged, right? They kind of turn up, and then they can sink, right? And then they get buried at the bottom of the lake in this particular case, right? They get buried. And then over time, as more sediment comes in to the lake, what happens then, there is an entrenching of that particular tree or whatever else into the strata. On the right, that's what you see. That's a picture of a polystrata fossil in Nova Scotia. And you can see here that it was some sort of large tree or reed, and it's buried in the middle of all of this rock, okay? And in the end, how does that happen, right? How does that happen? There's no mechanism for that to be able to happen unless there is some sort of catastrophic event, right? Nature does not allow a fossil to form quickly. There is no natural mechanism to do that, right, other than a catastrophe, maybe like a flood or a volcanic eruption, okay? So already we're seeing that polystrate fossils are a big piece of evidence against evolution. So strata and polystrate fossils. Braden? All right, now what about coal? Okay, so the typical thoughts of how coal is formed is that there is a layer of peat that is formed in swamps when the ocean overruns a swamp, that the pressure from all the extra water will condense the peat into coal, right? That is kind of the way we think that coal is created, or at least that's the evolutionary viewpoint, okay? Hit it again, Braden. However, what we see, so this is a picture of Spirit Lake, and you can see just the massive amounts of logs that are there. Okay, and what do you notice, if you can see it, I don't know how well you can see it, what do you notice about the logs there? They're stacked on top of each other, they're banging against each other. What else do you see? You may not be able to quite see it in this picture. What's that? There is that as well, right? A lot of dirt, right? What I'm wanting you to notice here is that many of them don't have a ton of bark on them anymore. Okay, why would that be? Yeah, they're waterlogged, they're sitting there forever, right? And pretty soon they're rubbing against each other with wind and waves or whatever else. Absolutely. So what happens then is the bark falls off and then floats down to the bottom of the lake. Okay, so I think his name is Austin, Stephen Austin. I know that name's funny, but he's actually gone down to the bottom of Spirit Lake and done some scuba exploration. And what do you think is found down there? A ton of peat. Peat is starting to form in just a few decades because all of that bark, waterlogged bark with the pressure of the water, is starting to be squished down there at the bottom of Spirit Lake, right? And so peat is already starting to be formed, which will later probably turn into coal, okay? So what do you see? In decades, you have the formation of peat and on the way to coal, and it doesn't take thousands and hundreds of thousands or millions of years, right? It's taking years and or decades and not massive amounts of time. Okay, so Mount St. Helens is a great laboratory, a great teacher for us to show us that we don't have to have this massive amount of time in order for these things to actually happen, right? And so when you start looking at the burden of proof, right, which definitely is on the evolutionists to say that creation is false, right? There's so many physical pieces of evidence to show that there are no mechanisms that make sense for these things in the evolutionary process, right? So, like Matlock, right? You know, the defendant gets up and, walks out of the courtroom because case closed, right? Case closed, you're done, right? Because there are no physical ways that this can happen with evolutionary thinking, right? And so there's no explanation for them. Now, you'll go on and you'll look at the internet and they'll have explanations for them, but their explanations typically are very almost silly. And you can tell they're grasping at straws. And by the way, none of this evidence is ever presented in textbooks because it flies in the face of evolutionary theory, and so basically most of this evidence is suppressed. Nobody's talking about this because they don't want people questioning their theory. Yes?
Who was the guy that died in the middle of that? Was it Truman?
Yeah, I believe, yeah.
So is he going to be a fossil in 30 years?
He may have already have been a fossil. So, yeah, how do these things happen, right? Did I see another hand? I thought I saw another hand. No?
I just gave you thought, they got the date from, Vesuvius and Pompeii, and when it was, the carbon dating, and everything that was done with that, and how that, I don't know if you can talk about that.
I'm not, actually. I hadn't planned on talking about that. It kind of...
Comparisons on the dating mechanism of that, because
you know exactly when it was covered, right? Exactly, and it was covered quickly. Things that I don't have time to cover here in the class, I want you guys to go into your book and kind of look at this. It's in chapter 19. And here's the idea of all of them, okay? Every one of them is that at some point in history, somebody dug down and they saw in the strata, in the ground, stuff that shouldn't be there if it was millions of years old, right? And there's a metallic vase that was dug up in Massachusetts, some grooved spheres in South Africa. There's chalk balls in France. There were, this is interesting, it's 325 page on your book. In Philadelphia, they took up this, they were digging and they found some granite. They sliced the granite and there were letters engraved in the granite. It's just amazing. There's some footprints and other things. So, and all of those are things that should not have existed, right? And they show that man was there in times in the geologic column where he shouldn't have been there, right? And there's massive amounts of these, and they're in your book, right? Matter of fact, one of them, I guess I will talk about one of them, just really briefly. It's the Meister footprint. This is talked about on page 326 in your book. Basically what it is, it's a footprint of a human, but it's got the trilobite fossils with the footprint of a human, right? Their index fossils, which were 55 to 65 million years old, right, are inside the same cavity as a footprint of a human. By the way, the human was wearing a sandal. Anyway, I'll let you discover more on your own. I don't know that. It doesn't say. It did. One of the other ones did have. It left an indentation of a stitch, so it was, it was newer, right? So these things that shouldn't be in the ground at those points in the geologic column are there, right? And so there's a whole bunch of them. And you don't need them all, right? There's a whole bunch of them. Okay. With the time that I have left, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is probably the best argument they got. And it comes from kind of astronomy. And the argument is this, is that if the Earth is only 6,000 years old approximately, then how do we see the light from distant stars? Okay, so the idea goes like this. Light travels 1 light year in a year, right? So a light year is actually a measure of distance, not time. Okay, it's a measure of distance. It's the distance that light would travel in a year, okay, and it's 5.88 trillion miles, okay? If the Earth is only 6,000 years old, then how are we seeing light from anything that's more than 6,000 light years away? Now we know, because we can measure through kind of parallax, we can measure how far the stars are away, and we know they're farther away than that, okay? So then the question comes, then how are we seeing the light from stars that are more than 6,000 light years away? Matter of fact, we see light from stars that we know that are actually millions of light years away, right? This is their best argument, I think. Like, it's the one I'm like, I ponder this all the time. Like, how do you explain this? Okay, so we're going to talk about a few, but here's what's the amazing thing is, none of the arguments that I'm going to talk to you about can be proven. Okay, none of the things that I say that in defense of creation can be proven. Okay, there's 6 good arguments, and I'll talk about those. However, if you're an evolutionist, this is not an argument that you can use against a creationist. You know why? Because the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe has a similar problem. It's the exact same problem. They have a time problem. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that first. And then we'll talk about some things to explain it. So this is written by Robert Newton. It says, light travel time, a problem for the Big Bang. The distant starlight problem is sometimes used as an argument against biblical creation. People who believe in billions of years often claim that light from the most distant galaxies could not possibly reach Earth in only 6,000 years. However, the light travel time argument cannot be used to reject the Bible in favor of the Big Bang with its billions of years. This is because the Big Bang model also has a light travel time problem. Okay, in 1964, Penzias and Wilson discovered that the Earth was bathed in a faint microwave radiation, apparently coming from the most distant observable regions of the universe. and this earned them the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1978. This cosmic microwave background, or CMB, comes from all directions in space and has a characteristic temperature. While the discovery of the CMB has been called a successful prediction of the Big Bang model, it's actually a problem for the Big Bang. This is because the precisely uniform temperature of the CMB creates a light travel time problem for the Big Bang models of the origin of the universe. The temperature of the CMB is essentially the same everywhere, in all directions, to a precision of 1 part in 100,000. And by the way, that's super pure. Like, we don't even, anyway, that's super pure. I don't have time to explain all that. However, in the early universe, the temperature of the CMB would have been very different at different places in space due to the random nature of the initial conditions. These different regions could come to the same temperatures if they were in close contact. More distant regions would come to equilibrium by exchanging radiation, in the form of light typically, and radiation would carry energy from warmer regions to cooler ones until they had the same temperature. Okay, you see this happening actually right now with the sun and the earth, right? The earth is at a different temperature of the sun. The earth gives off radiation in several different forms, but one form is light, right? And that light comes to the earth and then helps to keep it warmer, right? But if it wasn't warmer, guess what would happen? We would actually transfer energy the other direction, right? This has everything to do with the first and second law of thermodynamics, which we've already talked about, okay? But here's the deal. You still have to, if you're going to have differences in heat, they have to have been close enough to affect one another at some point, okay? At some point, like gravity, radiation has a, how do I put this? Radiation has an effect that has a significantly diminishing consequence as distance increases, right? Gravity, well, never mind. Gravity is indirectly proportional to the square of the distance, right? Which means the farther you go away, the faster it diminishes, right? And it goes up with the square. And actually, no, it goes up to the 4th power. Anyway, I'm not prepared to talk about that today. Anyway, it's a big difference. Okay, so the problem is this. Even assuming the Big Bang time scale, there has not been enough time for light to travel between widely separated regions of space. So how can the different regions of the current CMB have precisely uniform temperatures if they've never communicated with each other, right, through light? This is a light travel time problem. The Big Bang model assumes that the universe is many billions of years old. While this timescale is sufficient for light to travel from distant galaxies to Earth, it does not provide enough time for light to travel from one side of the visible universe to the other. At the time the light was emitted, supposedly 300,000 years after the Big Bang, space already had a uniform temperature over the range at least 10 times larger than the distance that light could have traveled. This is called the horizon. So how can these regions look the same and have the same temperature? How can one side of the visible universe know about the other side if there has not been enough time for the information to be exchanged? This is called the horizon problem. Secular astronomers have proposed many possible solutions to it, but no satisfactory one has emerged to date. Okay, so I said all that to say this. They have the same problem. It's in the opposite direction, right? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, right? Light at the distant reaches of the universe has not had time to travel all the way. It's had time maybe to travel to the Earth, but not all the way, right? And so there is no good model for the Big Bang, and when it comes to time-light theory as well, okay? So anybody ever tries to, what about distant starlight? Rip that out on them, right? Because they don't have an answer for their model either. Now, I love the fact that, and if you look at this, go to Genesis 1. We often overlook this. It is so simple, and yet we're still learning all this stuff so many years later, right? 3rd verse of the Bible. 3rd verse, right? Then God said, "Let there be light." right? And there was light. And God said that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, right? The first thing that God created is still the thing that's confounding us to this day. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? Yes. Right? It's still confounding us to this day, and we can't explain why light does the way that it does, nor is there a model that shows why we can see distant starlight now. Okay? Now, I'm going to go through 6 different things very, very quickly, 6 different kind of theories about how light can be here on the earth, even though it probably breaks all of the known mechanisms about the way that light travels, right? And they're all very, how do I put this? Unproven is probably the best way to say it. They're unproven because light still confounds us to this very day. Okay, the first one is that God created everything mature. So the idea is that the light that we see today, when God created light, that light was already kind of on its way, right? So the argument for that is when God created Adam, he didn't create Adam as a baby and then let Adam grow up, right? He didn't create the fruit trees as seedlings and let them grow up. They were already producing fruit, okay? So that's one possible way that God created the universe full grown, like we see what he did there in the garden. There are some problems with that when it comes to starlight, because in the end, if we're seeing light and it came to us, from something beyond 6,000 years old, then we're seeing a picture of something that doesn't actually exist, right? And so I don't like this theory very much because in this particular case, God would be showing us pictures of things that aren't real, right? And that's not typically in God's nature, right? So I don't like this argument very much, but it is a possibility. The second one is that the universe is expanding, and we know that and we can see that. And I've quoted Robert Jastrow before when he talks about that, and basically says that the universe is not eternal. But what we see is that at some point, right, the universe was closer together, and if it was closer together, the light would not have had to travel nearly as far, okay? And if that's the case, then that is a possible way to think about it, is that the light began its journey when they were much, much closer than they are today, okay? That's another way of thinking about it. There's also one that gravity plays a role on time, and that the Earth is like a gravitational well, and because the Earth has this gravity, that time travels slower through a gravity well, right? And so with relativistic, Einstein talked about the theory of relativity, and it had a lot to do with light. With relativistic types of thinking, then in a gravity well, time travels or time passes differently for those that are under the influence of that gravity well, okay? And it means that it's hard to explain, that when you are close to sources of great gravity, typically time slows down for you. So time is faster, right, potentially for the light that is coming to you, even though locally we feel the time passing slower, right? And this is actually something has been proven. They've proven this with atomic clocks.
In other words, if we can get outside of our solar system and do a light test away from the sun, and the effects of gravity and speed of light may be greatly different.
They may be greatly different.
But because we can't test it, we don't know.
Yeah, it's not testable, although I have something here that says for that, right? We think of light speed as a constant, but it may not be. And so there's many different ways. There's theories also, I won't talk a lot about this one, that space is curved, and that the light travels faster through curved space than it does through, what would be like a Euclidean space, right? So there's all kinds of different things. I told you this is very heady. So this is, to your point, Bob, It says, while light travels at a constant speed, 186,000 miles per second on Earth, we are not certain how or how fast light travels in a distant place. In 2000, the Associated Press recounted how scientists had broken the speed of light. The report noted that in an experiment in Princeton, New Jersey, physicists sent a pulse of laser light through a cesium vapor so quickly that it left the chamber before it had even finished entering. The pulse traveled 310 times the distance it would have covered if the chamber had contained a vacuum. Researchers say that it is the most convincing demonstration yet that the speed of light, supposedly an ironclad rule of nature, can be pushed beyond known boundaries, at least under certain laboratory circumstances. So light could potentially travel faster than we think it can, based upon the things that we don't know about, like the makeup of the universe. Okay, so also very heady. Yes.
I just have a genuine question, because I think you're saying a lot of this is heavy. It is heavy.
It's really big.
With like 1 Corinthians 3, 18 and 19, you know, where God says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness
Yeah.
before God, and for the great He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the reasoning of the wise, that they are useless. So then let no one boast in men, for all things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos." And so he goes on and he's just talking about this. And I'm genuinely asking, because I don't, you know this stuff better than I do, but could it be that, like you said, that the understanding of light is so above us that we could be just completely wrong about it? So because of that, I mean, when God put them in place, it could seem like you just said, which is He's just showing us something that's not there, or it's just very confusing to us as a whole, but that He just simply created them all at the same time, like the creation says, and that our brains just can't understand the concept of time and space and Him being outside of it, and us not having a full understanding of these things.
I think it has a lot to do with that. I think God will continue to confound us. We will never understand the spiritual things based upon the physical world around us. I think God is sending us a very subtle message. Trust me, right? Trust me. And we keep trying to explain it, but there's some things that just can't be explained. Yeah, I agree 100%. I'm way out of time. Hey, maybe I'm in a gravity well. One last thing. So I'll just leave you with this one. And this is the last of the arguments. Some scientists have suggested that synchronization may play an important factor in the starlight and time problem. This concept is best explained by considering the different time zones in the United States. For instance, on a normal weekend, I fly home, Brad, through the airport in Atlanta, Georgia. Normally, I leave Atlanta is almost exactly the same time I arrive in Nashville due to the 1-hour time change. For instance, I leave Atlanta at 9 p.m. and arrive at Nashville at 9 p.m. From the perspective of the clock, it appears as if the trip was instantaneous. However, in looking at the actual time spent on a plane, it is obvious that the trip included an hour of travel. So looking at it this way, the trip arrived at the same time using local time, but it took an hour when using universal time. So the idea is that there's this difference between cosmic local time and cosmic universal time, okay? It's kind of hard to understand, but basically, if you're moving one direction, it could be, if you look at it relativistically, that it happened instantaneously, okay? And let me just read again in Genesis chapter 1. Let's read starting in verse 14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from night, and let them be for signs, for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light on the earth." And it was so. According to this, why were the things out there in the heavens created? So that we could have light on the earth. Okay? So it might be that the cosmic local time is what is being referred to here in Genesis 1. Okay? Now that I've confused you all, I'm going to end class and let you go study it by yourself. Right? Some things we're just not going to be able to understand. And I think God is saying, come and seek me. Know who I am. right, understand that my ways are above your ways, right? My thoughts are above your thoughts, and we'll just never understand some of these things completely. All right, thank you for class.